In the late 1800s, in a small port city slowly transforming under the pressure of industrialization, a man named Thomas works as a lighthouse keeper, living between the rhythms of the sea and the rigid expectations of a society obsessed with progress. And each night he climbs the same narrow stairs, lights the same lamp, and watches the same horizon. Yet, internally, he feels a growing tension between stability and change. Because while the city expands, machines multiply, and new technologies promise speed and efficiency, his own life remains defined by repetition, isolation, and silence. And this contrast forces him into a deep internal reflection about what progress truly means, whether it is measured by external growth or by internal coherence. And as he observes ships arriving from distant lands, carrying people, ideas, and ambitions, he becomes increasingly aware that history is not only written by inventors and leaders, but also by those who maintain continuity, who preserve light in the midst of transformation. And this realization unsettles him because it challenges the narrative that only movement creates meaning, and he begins to question whether staying in one place is a form of stagnation or a form of quiet resistance against a world that equates value with speed, productivity, and visible success. And in this tension between motion and stillness, Thomas senses that his role is not to escape history, but to inhabit it differently, to become a witness to change without being consumed by it. And as he lights the lamp once again, he understands that his life, though seemingly insignificant, is part of a larger historical structure, one that depends not only on innovation, but on presence, responsibility, and the quiet discipline of keeping the light on for others who are constantly in motion. As years pass, Thomas begins to notice how the ships change, growing larger, faster, louder, how their engines replace sails, how their crews become more hurried, more transactional, less connected to the sea itself. And this evolution creates a subtle emotional distance between him and the world he serves, because he feels increasingly like a relic, a human component in a system that no longer values patience or attentiveness. And this awareness leads him to reflect on how history slowly replaces not only tools, but entire ways of being, entire relationships with time, work, and meaning. And he realizes that while society celebrates innovation as liberation, it often forgets to ask what is being lost in the process, what forms of knowledge disappear when efficiency becomes the dominant value. And as he watches automated lights being installed in nearby ports, he senses that his profession itself is becoming obsolete, not through failure, but through progress. And this realization confronts him with a deep existential question, whether a life built on usefulness can remain meaningful once that usefulness is no longer required. And he feels a quiet grief, not dramatic, not angry, but reflective, because his identity is slowly dissolving without any clear moment of ending. And in this emotional space, Thomas understands that history does not only create heroes and revolutions, it also creates silent disappearances, professions, skills, and identities that fade gently into irrelevance without ever being mourned. One morning, Thomas is informed that within a year, the lighthouse will be fully automated, and although the announcement is delivered calmly as a practical update rather than a personal event, he feels an immediate internal shift, as if time itself has suddenly acquired a deadline, and he begins to see his daily routines differently, no longer as endless cycles, but as limited moments that will soon disappear. And this awareness alters his emotional relationship with space, with the stairs he climbs, the room he sleeps in, the horizon he observes, because everything now feels temporary, even though it has defined his entire adult life. And he reflects on how modern society frames change as opportunity, while for individuals it often manifests as quiet loss, a loss of identity rather than income, of rhythm rather than status. And he realizes that no one will truly replace him, because machines do not inherit memory. They do not remember storms, near collisions, or nights when human judgment prevented disaster. And this absence of continuity troubles him because it suggests that history values function over experience, output over presence. And as he walks through the lighthouse one evening, touching the walls, the railing, the glass, he becomes aware that he is not simply losing a job. He is losing a personal relationship with place, with purpose, with a version of himself that existed only within this narrow vertical world. And this realization forces him to confront the uncomfortable truth that many lives do not end with dramatic conclusions. They end with gradual irrelevance, with systems evolving beyond the need for human participation. And this form of ending feels emotionally complex because it is not tragic enough to be recognized, yet significant enough to reshape identity entirely. In the months that follow, Thomas begins to experiment with imagining a future beyond the lighthouse, something he has never allowed himself to do before. And this process feels strangely unnatural because his identity has always been defined by presence rather than projection, by maintaining rather than planning. And as he tries to picture himself in the city, working among crowds, adapting to schedules dictated by machines instead of tides, he experiences a deep internal resistance. Not fear of failure, but fear of losing the quiet version of himself that emerged through years of solitude. And this resistance leads him to reflect on how environments shape personality, how isolation cultivated his attentiveness, his patience, his emotional self-sufficiency, and how urban life might demand a completely different psychological structure, one oriented around performance, speed, and constant interaction. And he wonders whether people adapt to history or whether history selects which personalities can survive within it. And this thought unsettles him because it suggests that identity is not only personal but conditional, shaped by the systems one inhabits. And as he walks through the city streets, observing factories, offices, and electric lights, he feels both curiosity and alienation, recognizing that progress offers comfort and opportunity, yet also requires a form of psychological conformity, a willingness to compress oneself into standardized roles. And this realization forces him to confront a central question: whether freedom lies in participating fully in the dominant system or in maintaining a personal relationship with meaning, even if that relationship becomes increasingly invisible to the world. One evening, Thomas meets an old sailor at a small harbor cafe, a man who once relied on the lighthouse as much as Thomas himself maintained it. And their conversation drifts naturally toward memory, storms survived, routes forgotten, ports that no longer exist. And through this exchange, Thomas becomes aware of a shared emotional geography, a world shaped not by maps or schedules, but by lived experience, by intuition, and by a deep embodied knowledge of the sea. And this recognition creates a sense of quiet solidarity because both men now occupy roles that history is slowly dissolving, replaced by systems that prioritize efficiency over human perception. And as they talk, Thomas realizes that what they are mourning is not simply lost professions, but a lost relationship with time, a slower rhythm of existence where decisions were guided by attention rather than automation. And this insight leads him to reflect on how modernity redefines trust, transferring it from human judgment to technical reliability. And while this transition increases safety and speed, it also reduces the emotional depth of participation, turning lived experience into background noise behind technological processes. And in this emotional space, Thomas understands that his grief is not personal, it is historical, a response to witnessing the end of a certain way of being in the world. And this realization softens his resistance to change because it allows him to see his own transition not as individual failure, but as part of a larger transformation that countless others experience invisibly across generations. As the final months approach, Thomas begins to document his routines in a small notebook, not for any official purpose, but as a way of preserving a form of knowledge that no machine will ever require. And he writes about the way fog behaves differently depending on wind direction, how certain ships approach the harbor more cautiously than others, how light feels less mechanical when adjusted by human hands. And through this act of writing, he becomes aware that memory itself is a form of resistance, a refusal to allow experience to disappear completely into abstraction. And this awareness leads him to reflect on how history often remembers inventions, but forgets the emotional labor that sustained them, the countless invisible acts of attention, responsibility, and care that kept systems functioning long before automation arrived. And he realizes that his notebook is not a protest against progress, but a quiet archive of human presence within it. And as he rereads his own words, he feels a subtle shift in his identity, no longer defined solely by his role as a lighthouse keeper, but as a witness to transition, someone who can articulate the emotional dimension of historical change. And this recognition offers him a new sense of purpose because it allows him to carry forward the meaning of his past work into a future where its practical necessity no longer exists, transforming loss into narrative rather than silence. On one of his last nights at the lighthouse, Thomas climbs the stairs more slowly than usual, aware that each step now carries a different emotional weight. And he notices details he once ignored: the worn texture of the railing, the faint sound of waves echoing through the structure, the way the light casts long shadows across the walls. And this heightened awareness feels almost ceremonial, as if his body is unconsciously preparing for closure. And he reflects on how repetition creates intimacy, how doing the same action thousands of times allows meaning to emerge, not from novelty, but from continuity. And this understanding leads him to realize that his life was not defined by dramatic events, but by sustained attention, by showing up consistently in a role that required presence even when no one was watching. And as he stands beside the lamp, he feels a complex emotional blend: gratitude for the years of purpose, sadness for their ending, and a quiet acceptance that history moves forward regardless of personal attachment. And in this acceptance, Thomas senses that letting go does not mean erasing the past. It means allowing it to exist without demanding permanence. And this internal shift feels like the final stage of his transition, from someone who maintained the light for others into someone who can carry that light internally as a way of relating to the world with patience, attentiveness, and emotional responsibility, even beyond the walls of the lighthouse. As the day of departure finally arrives, Thomas wakes before sunrise and sits quietly at the small wooden table in his room, listening to the distant sound of waves and feeling an unfamiliar sense of emotional suspension, because for the first time in decades he has no defined task waiting for him, no lamp to light, no schedule dictated by tides, and this absence feels heavier than exhaustion ever did. And he realizes how deeply his sense of identity was intertwined with obligation, with being needed in a way that felt concrete and irreplaceable. And now, in the quiet of early morning, he is forced to confront a future shaped by choice rather than necessity. And this shift unsettles him, because choice requires self-definition, something he has not practiced for most of his adult life. And as he packs his few belongings, he notices how little he truly owns, how most of his emotional wealth existed in routines rather than objects, in familiarity rather than accumulation. And this recognition leads him to reflect on how modern narratives equate fulfillment with expansion, with acquiring more, experiencing more, achieving more, while his own life was built around refinement, around deepening a single relationship with place, responsibility, and time. And he wonders whether this form of existence will become unintelligible to future generations, whether anyone will understand what it meant to devote an entire life to a role that required presence more than ambition. And as he walks through the empty lighthouse one last time, touching the walls, listening to the echo of his footsteps, he feels a quiet grief that is not about loss of status or comfort, but about the end of a particular way of inhabiting the world, a way rooted in patience, solitude, and sustained attention. And this grief does not collapse into despair. Instead, it transforms into a reflective acceptance, because he realizes that although the structure will remain, the meaning it held was always human, always relational, and cannot be replicated by automation. And in this understanding, Thomas senses that his true legacy is not the light itself, but the quality of presence he brought to it, and that this presence can now exist beyond the lighthouse, carried internally into whatever future unfolds, not as resistance to change, but as a quiet continuation of meaning in a world that no longer needs his role, but still needs his way of being. As Thomas leaves the lighthouse behind and walks toward the city, the structure slowly disappearing into the morning mist, he becomes aware of how history rarely marks these moments, how no one records the emotional ending of roles that simply become unnecessary. And this thought stays with him as he enters a world defined by speed, electricity, and constant movement. And he feels both curiosity and disorientation, because for the first time his life is not anchored to a fixed place, and this freedom feels ambiguous rather than liberating. And he reflects on how progress creates mobility but also erodes depth, replacing long-term relationships with temporary engagements. And this realization makes him question whether modern identity is built on flexibility at the cost of continuity. And as he observes people rushing through streets, absorbed in tasks and schedules, he senses that his own internal rhythm no longer matches the dominant tempo of society. And this mismatch does not feel like failure, but like a different form of consciousness, one that values attention over efficiency, presence over acceleration. And he understands that his years in isolation cultivated a way of perceiving time that cannot be easily integrated into industrial logic. And rather than trying to adopt completely, he chooses to preserve this internal rhythm as a personal form of resistance, not political, not dramatic, but existential, a decision to remain emotionally slow in a fast world. And in this choice, Thomas experiences a quiet resolution, because he no longer measures his worth through usefulness or relevance, but through the quality of his awareness, his capacity to observe, remember, and exist without constant justification. And as the city noise surrounds him, he does not feel erased by history, but redefined within it, understanding that although his role has ended, his way of being remains intact. And this realization allows him to step forward into an uncertain future, not as someone left behind by progress, but as someone who carries a deeper relationship with time, meaning, and presence into a world that desperately needs to remember how to slow down.